My name is Sarah Thunberg. I am your chair for this afternoon. I'm a researcher at NDARC. So this is a special week. It's NAIDOC week. And so it's time for us all to celebrate our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, achievements and culture. So with this in mind, I pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the lands in which we meet. I'm joining you today from Ngambri and Ngunnawal country. And in particular, I pay my respect to any Aboriginal people joining today and show our respect to elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to extend a particular welcome to any First Nations people who are joining us today and wish you all a happy NAIDOC week. Okay, today we are in for a treat. We have got NDARC's own Professor Don Weatherburn, who's presenting to us on do increases in gambling expenditure lead to more crime? Don is one of our gun researchers who's really good at looking at data and doing fun things with it. So it'll be interesting to hear what Don has done with today's work. Before coming to NDARC, Don was Executive Director at BOXA, so New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research, and Research Director at the Judicial Commission of New South Wales. After Don has presented, he will be joined on a panel discussion by Rebecca Jenkins. Dr. Rebecca Jenkins is Research Director at the Child's Rights Team at the Australian Human Rights Commission. And she has over 25 years experience in research across government, non-government, university, most recently in the fields of violence protection, gambling, alcohol and other drugs, and young people's health. Rebecca is currently on secondment to the commission, from the Commission to the Australian Gambling Research Centre at the Australian Institute of Family Studies. So it'll be a really nice panel discussion, I think, where we've got a range of different views and experiences. So I'll get out of your way. Oh, sorry. And after the presentation, we'll do a Q&A. So please chuck your questions into the Q&A section down the bottom of your screen, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. All right, over to you, Don. So I'll ask you to just turn your camera and your mic on, and we'll get going. Oh, hello, there you are.
Good to be here. Thanks everyone for tuning in. I just want to begin by acknowledging my co-investigators, Wai Yin Wan and Joanna Wang, without whom this study wouldn't have been completed. I'd also like to thank Liquor and Gaming New South Wales for providing the data on electronic gaming machine gross profit, and of course my alma mater, the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research, for providing the crime data used in this analysis. So let's kick off with a bit of background, or at least we would if I could get this working. Right, there we are. In the fiscal year 21-22, Australians spent a total of $24 billion on gambling, in case you didn't know that. That's $1,200 per capita for everyone over the age of 15. Most of this money was spent on electronic gaming machines. That pie chart there shows you the split for various forms of gambling. 86% of it, believe it or not, is actually coming from electronic gaming machines, poker machines by another name, smaller proportions coming from other sorts of gaming. Everybody knows, or most people know, that problem gambling has been shown to be associated with increased psychological stress, financial stress, increased risk of divorce, risky alcohol consumption, increased risk of unemployment, and increased risk of crime victimization. But everybody also knows that problem gamblers have lots of other problems. So what you're looking at here is the percentage of the Australian population aged 15 and over who cite gambling problems by problem type. You can see that only 1.36% borrowed or sold things to make up for the losses in gambling. But at the bottom, you can see that 4.41% bet more than they could afford at some stage. That might not sound a great deal, but 4.4% of the population over 15 is about 914,000 people across Australia. So it's obvious that gambling has, whatever its positive benefits, has a number of adverse consequences associated with it. The gambling problems, of course, are not confined to people who actually do the gambling. A number of studies have shown a link between gambling and crime. I won't go through them all. I've listed some of the references there, and there will be a paper soon enough, I hope, that you can look those up and have a look at the individual level studies that have been done on gambling and self-reported involvement in crime. Gambling is also a common way of laundering money obtained from crime. There are a couple of ways of doing this. I don't encourage any of you to try it. One is to offer to pay cash to a legitimate gambler who's accumulated credits or has winning tickets. The offender can then use the credits or tickets as a basis for explaining the possession of large amounts of cash that would not otherwise be readily explicable. Another trick is to insert large amounts of cash or credits into electronic gaming machines and engage in minimal or no gameplay to appear like a real player before cashing out. The reason this is important is because money laundering and the expenditure of proceeds of crime on gambling are major issues in and of themselves. Well, the individual level studies which have looked at the relationship between problem gambling and crime are great, but what they don't do is reveal the scale of the connection between gambling and crime. And what I mean by that is that they don't tell us what size change in crime we get from a given increase in gambling expenditure, or what offences are affected by increases in gambling expenditure, if any of them are, and also what size change in gambling expenditure we get from a given increase in crime. Only 3 studies that I've been able to find have examined any of these issues, and all of them been focused on that issue of what size change in crime we get from a given increase in gambling expenditure. Bridges and Williamson in Canada found a significant positive bivariate relationship between the number of gambling venues per province in Canada and rates of burglary, motor vehicle theft and robbery. Wheeler in Australia obtained similar results using electronic gaming machine expenditure and a crime across the local areas of South Australia. Then in 2010, they repeated the study in Victoria and obtained pretty similar results. And then perhaps one of the more impressive studies by Humphreys and Lee, they conducted a fixed effect panel study of the relationship between crime and the number of video lottery terminals across 78 police divisions and municipalities of Alberta, Canada, over the period 1977 and 2007. Now, the distinctive thing about that study is that because it was longitudinal, they were better able to sort out cause and effect. And when they did, they found less effect from gambling than the earlier studies had shown using cross-sectional studies. They found increases in credit card fraud, prostitution, and robbery, but they actually found decreases in shoplifting. Well, there are problems, as you would have guessed, with all of these studies. One of them is that most of the US research involves the effect of casinos. That's where most of the gambling appears to take place. So people have looked before and after casinos have been established and compared that to areas where they weren't established. But casinos, as I've already explained, don't account for the bulk of gambling expenditure in Australia. The second problem is that most of the aggregate level gambling studies are cross-sectional. You know, they take a particular point in time and they look at the relationship between gambling expenditure or the number of poker machines and crime. Trouble with that, of course, is that you can't tell whether gambling's increasing crime or crime's increasing gambling or both. Humphreys and Lee, the study I mentioned a minute ago, which is one of the better studies, unfortunately made no distinction between the effect of casino and video lottery terminals. But more importantly, from our perspective, they didn't actually measure gambling expenditure. And that's the thing which policymakers are most or best equipped to influence. So what's missing is a rigorous longitudinal study focused on the reciprocal effects of gambling expenditure and crime. And what I mean by that is not only the effects of gambling expenditure on crime, but also the effects of crime on gambling expenditure. So now let's get to the details of the current study. So what we did was we employed a panel of 48 monthly observations of crime and gambling expenditure across 126 New South Wales local government areas between the 28th of December 2015 to the 5th of January 2020. So you've got these 48 observations across time in each of the 126 local government areas. We didn't look at all of them because some of them, as you'll see, don't have much crime, if any. So we examined 7 different offences: assault, break, enter and steal dwelling, break, enter and steal non-dwelling, which is mainly shops or factories, motor vehicle theft, stealing from a motor vehicle, stealing from a retail store, stealing from the person, and fraud. And we control for or remove all time constant differences between LGAs. For those of you in the know, in other words, we're applying what amounts to a fixed effect panel study. In plain terms, what we're doing is looking at the relationship between gambling and crime within each LGA rather than across the local government areas. And what that means is that all the time constant differences between LGAs are basically accounted for. We also control for seasonal effects. And finally, we control for any time varying factor like income or unemployment that affects all local government areas. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. So the analysis is a little complicated, and I'll just walk you through it. So the first thing to do is to check if the data is stationary, simply because time series analyses require stationary data, except in one case I'll come to. And what I mean by stationary is roughly they have a constant mean and variance. I can tell you now that all the variables in this analysis are non-stationary, except gross profit, assault, and stealing from a person, which we're able to analyze in conventional time series terms. But where the variables are non-stationary, we can't simply regress crime against gambling expenditure and controls. Instead, what we have to do is check whether crime and gambling expenditure are co-integrated. Well, I can hear you all saying, what on earth does co-integrated mean? So I'm just going to give you a simple example rather than walk you through any maths. This is a famous article written by Murray called A Drunk and Her Dog. I don't know why I said her dog, but we'll let that pass for the moment. And it's an illustration of co-integration. And basically the idea along the bottom here is you've got the number of minutes since leaving the pub. This is purely hypothetical. Please don't think there's been an experiment like this. And on the ordinate, what you've got is the distance between the dog and the man. And what you can see is that it's certainly non-stationary. It's going up and down. But you'll also notice that there's sort of a fixed distance between the movement of the dog and the movement of the drunk. There's a fair degree of random variation around that. For example, in minute 10, the dog and the man head in the same direction. In week 20, they don't head in the same direction, but you can see the general point. Now, if we'd taken first differences and removed the trend, this is what we would have seen, no relationship at all. So we need a mechanism for analyzing relationship where the short-term fluctuations aren't related to one another, long-term relationship between them. And that's essentially what we're going to do in this study. So moving right along, step 2, we're going to conduct a Granger causality test. I'm sorry for telling you all this detail, but you need to look under the bonnet of the car if you want to know how we got to the end. So the Granger causality test is basically, if changes in gambling expenditure affect crime, then we'd expect changes in expenditure at time t or month t to be associated with changes in crime at the next month and maybe the month after as well. Likewise, if changes in crime affect gambling expenditure, then we'd expect changes in crime at time t or month t to be associated with changes in expenditure the next month and maybe after that. But if that's all we saw, we'd be thinking to ourselves, well, that could come about just because there was an upward trend in gambling expenditure or an upward trend in crime. So the third condition is crucial in the Granger test. We want to see whether those correlations persist when we control for past values of crime and expenditure. In other words, we remove any possibility that the preceding trends are responsible for it, and we simply look at the relationship between crime at a particular month, expenditure in a particular month and crime in the next month or vice versa. I hope that's reasonably clear. So there's the results of the Granger tests. On the left-hand side, you've got the offences, just to remind you: assault, break, enter and steal, dwelling, break, enter and steal, non-dwelling. BEs, both kinds of break and enter combined, motor vehicle theft, stealing from a motor vehicle, stealing from a retail store, stealing from the person, and the stealing offences combined, finally fraud. If you look on the right-hand side of each panel, you'll see the p-values are all significant. That means that gross profit is influencing crime as far as the Granger test is concerned. And on the right-hand side, you've got the regression of expenditure against crime. And it's the same story there. They're all significant, although do note the p-value is a bit bigger on that side of the ledger than on the first one. All right, now we've done the Granger test. The next thing is to see whether crime and expenditure are co-integrated among non-stationary offences. I'm not going to tell you, I'm just going to tell you right now they are. So the last step is to construct a co-integration model of the relationship and use it to estimate the effect of gambling expenditure on crime. Now, I'm going to put up one equation only. You can look away if you wish, but I think it's important, as I say, to have a look under the bonnet if you're going to see how we get to the conclusion we did. So here's the model that's being fitted to each LGA. On the left-hand side, you've got the log of the crime in LGA I at time t. The next step you've got there is just the intercept. This term here is lagged expenditure. You remember I said that if you've got lagged expenditure, it helps control for any general trend in expenditure. You've also got lagged crime, which is nice because it helps control for any factors that influence crime up to the last month. Then you've got a term I won't bother too much with, but basically deals with a problem of cross-sectional error dependence. These terms here just monthly dummies to control for any seasonal effects. And this is the workhorse. This is a time trend which controls for any other factor, whatever it is, that influences all LGAs up or down. And then if you've got an error term, that's the last time you'll see an equation if you don't like the look of them. Okay, so the data sources. Liquor and Gaming New South Wales, as I said, generously provided us with electronic gaming machine gross profit data by month by LGA. And Boxar provided us with the recorded crime data by crime type and LGA. Now, key variables are the log of the monthly recorded crime and the log of the electronic gaming machine gross profit. And by the way, analysis is limited to LGAs with non-zero recorded crime in most months. So the output, the thing we really want out of this is the percentage change in offence J or whatever it is for a 1% change in gambling expenditure. I'm actually going to show it to you in terms of a 10% change because it's a little bit easier to digest. Okay, just descriptive stats first up. Not too much to pay attention to here, but there's one interesting thing I think you might want to look at. If you look at the row labeled gross profit, second from the top there, and you look at the mean expenditure per month, you'll see the mean is 4,582,254, which is a lot of money. And you'll see the standard deviation is 8,331,000. That's huge variation. Now, the next bit is what really gets me. The monthly minimum was a mere 16,109. That's the total amount of money, the minimum total amount of money that came in 1 month from one of the LGAs. But if you look on the far right panel, you'll see that in 1 month, one LGA made $63,224,142. All this, and my father told me never to gamble. Anyway, they are the descriptive stats for what they're worth. Let's now move to the results. So what you're looking at here is the effect of a 10% increase in gambling expenditure on crime, broken down by crime type. I'll explain the first couple and then you'll get the hang of it. So in assault, a 10% increase in gambling expenditure, we estimate using the model you saw, increases assault by 13%, stealing from a motor vehicle by about 11%, same for break, enter and steal non-dwelling, same for the stealing offences when combined. An 8% increase in fraud, 7% increase in break and enter combined, basically 7% in stealing from a retail store, 6% increase in motor vehicle theft, 6% increase in stealing from the person, and a 5% increase in break, enter and steal dwelling. They are, to my mind anyway, pretty remarkable results. I certainly wasn't expecting them. Now, I mentioned before, you remember the dog and the drunk walking along, and their short run movements can be random with respect to each other, which raises an interesting question. If the system does get knocked out of equilibrium, say by an oil price spike or sudden burst of inflation or whatever, how long does it take to restore the long run relationship between gambling expenditure and crime? Well, the answer is very quick. If you look along the bottom here, as usual, I've got the offences, and looking first at the stealing offences, you can see that 81% of the equilibrium is restored after just 1 month. And stealing from a motor vehicle, 82%, break and enter, 85%, and so on. You can see, looking at motor vehicle theft, the show's all over by essentially 1 month, 96% of the equilibrium has been recovered. The short story here is that expenditure and crime are moving in lockstep. There's not a lot of independent random movement going on. A month is pretty much enough to deal with most of that disequilibrium that occurs because of external factors. So what about the effect of an increase in crime on gambling expenditure? Well, here are the effects here of a 10% increase in crime on gambling expenditure, and the effects are not very big at all. A 10% increase in crime in assault, for example, increases gambling expenditure by about 1%. In the case of motor vehicle theft, it's by about half of 1%. For break, enter and steal dwelling, it's about half of 1%. It's less than half of 1% for stealing offences. And for break and enter, it's about 0.34%. The other offences are not shown because they weren't significant. You can get a better idea of the difference between the effect of gambling expenditure on crime compared with the effect of crime on gambling expenditure by putting the two together. And you can see not only are there some offences that have no effect at all or have no effect at all on gambling expenditure, when there is an effect, it's very small compared to the effect of gambling expenditure on crime. Okay, so let's summarise all of this. Basically, each 10% increase in gambling expenditure in New South Wales is associated with an annual 7.5% increase in assaults, 10 or 11% increase in break and enter dwelling offences, about a 10% increase in break and enter non-dwelling offences, an 11% increase in motor vehicle theft offences, 8% increase in stealing from a motor vehicle, and 7.4% increase in fraud offences. Some of you might prefer to see that in terms of raw numbers, so here they are. 10% increase in gambling expenditure would give us 4,500 additional assault offences, about 2,800 break and enter dwellings, 1,300 or 1,400 additional break and enter non-dwelling offences, 1,400 additional motor vehicle theft offences, 2,361 additional stealing from a motor vehicle, and close to 4,000 additional fraud offences each year. Now, there are always caveats, and these are the main ones that we think are worth paying attention to. The first thing is that we don't control for time-varying factors that influence some LGAs and not others. You remember that term in that equation where I said this is doing the lion's share of the work? That will cover anything that affects all LGAs, but if there's some factor that affects one LGA and not any of the others, or several and not any of the others, then that would be a problem for our analysis. The second point is to note here is that one should not walk away assuming this is true of all countries or even of all jurisdictions. Our results may not generalise to countries or jurisdictions where the stolen goods market is small. Obviously, if you're, for example, motivated to steal things to raise money for gambling, then, and there's no stolen goods market, you're going to be in trouble. So there may not be any effect. Obviously, of course, if gambling opportunities are limited, you may not see this sort of relationship, and the same is true with the gambling regulation is tighter. So what's the conclusion? Well, as if you needed me to tell you, electronic gaming machine gambling has major negative externalities. It increases property and violent crime. It creates opportunities for laundering money. If we want to reduce the opportunities and incentives for gambling, we should see significant reduction in property and violent crime. And there are a number of ways we could do that. I'm not an expert on how to do that, but obviously there's been lots of public discussion about limits on the number of machines, pre-commitment option for all venues, and advertising bans. Also, there's been much discussion and debate about whether poker machines should be made cashless. If they were, I'm sure we would see a reduction in money laundering. That's it from me.
Oh, thanks, Don. That was super interesting. Sorry, I'm just pulling up my notes. I love the way you use data to tell a story about what's happening in the communities. And thanks for putting up the translation of it back to numbers, because that's what I was wondering when you were presenting the percentages, was like, well, what does that mean in terms of how many assaults there are? Because every one of those is significant, right? And that's somebody's experience. So yeah, really interesting. And I've written down here about the model, the equation. I was slightly terrified, but I nearly followed it. So I feel pretty good with myself.
We can go back to it if you like.
Thanks. It's pretty alarming, really, like the associations that you found and how marked those numbers were. It's quite, I think it's like really impressive work, because it's quite higher than I thought it would be. Anyway, I won't take up any more time. So now I'm going to invite Beck to please join us and turn on her camera and mic. And we'll start to get on with our panel discussion and our Q&A. Hello, Beck, and welcome.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for the invitation, Don, to be here today. Really, really privileged to be here and to be joining you. And congratulations, Don. It's really a fascinating paper and such an important contribution to the evidence base around gambling harm in this country. So to you and your colleagues, thank you so much for your important work. I thought I would start just with a couple of key reflections, and then really some thoughts about potential next steps in where you might kind of take this to explore these links between gambling losses and crime in a little bit more detail. So let's just start with my reflections. And the first one is really just to highlight and I guess reflect on the value of this type of longitudinal secondary indicator data. I think as Don mentioned, you know, Australians lose around $24 to $25 billion a year on gambling. That actually makes us the world's biggest losers when it comes to gambling on a per capita basis. Part of the reason for us being the world's biggest losers is about availability of gambling in this country and accessibility of gambling. Even though, as one example, even though we make up less than 1% of the world's population, we actually have around 20% or 1 in 5 of the world's high intensity poker machines on our shores. So much of this is about the availability of gambling here in Australia. But despite this, this really widespread availability and accessibility of gambling, there's still gaps in our understandings around gambling, both gambling consumption, but really importantly, gambling harm in this country. In part, that's because gambling harms are often underreported or under-identified or not identified. But it's also because there are limitations to the data that we collect. A lot of the data we collect is based on self-report data, but also there are differences. So what we see in terms of some of the gambling data collections is a lack of consistency in how the data is collected, how we measure gambling consumption, how we measure gambling harm. So there's some inconsistencies there, but also around sample selection and other things. So I guess I just really wanted to highlight as my first reflection, the importance of this type of longitudinal analyses that Don and his colleagues have done here, and being able to draw on this kind of secondary indicator data. I think that's really important. So that was my first reflection. My second reflection is really more about the paper that Don's presented today really provides great evidence and a reminder about how people who gamble, individuals who gamble, might be affected by gambling and gambling harm. But I think that what I'm really taking away from this research is and what it highlights for me and draws attention to is harm to affected others. So to people who might be the victims of these types of violent and property crimes. Here, this is really important. In Australia and around the world, it's becoming increasingly recognised that gambling related harms not only affect individuals, but people's families and friends and the wider community. And I think that's very much being reflected in Don's work today. Just to highlight as an example, what we know a little bit about affected others, but some Australian researchers have looked at this in a little bit more detail, and what they were looking at is how many people on average could be affected by someone else's at-risk gambling. So what they found is that a person who might be experiencing high-risk gambling or problem gambling can affect up to 6 other people around them. Someone who might be classified as experiencing moderate risk gambling can affect up to 3 others around them, and someone classified at low risk gambling up to 1 other. And that's often close family members, including spouses and children, who might be most often identified as being affected. So that I'm really drawing on the importance of that from Don's work to highlight that others can be affected by gambling as well. So just to commend you, Don, and to your team again on what I see as a really important analysis, and it really does add to the evidence base on gambling harm in this country. So congratulations. They're my reflections. I do have some thoughts on potentially where you could take this next. Just some ideas. Things might not be possible based on what data might be available or not available, and where you want to take this. But I have 4 ideas about where you might want to go next, and maybe I'll just step through each one, and then we can come back and look at each one individually. The first thought I had is whether you can look at whether you can access initially, but look at this data for other jurisdictions across Australia and do some comparisons. And the reason I ask this is because pokies aren't evenly distributed across the country. So Don really highlighted the significant losses in New South Wales. So, I mean, I was fascinated to see, Don, that, across LGAs on average per month, community members are losing $4.5 million. That's striking. And then you mentioned, up to $60 million a month in some LGAs. They are significant losses that communities are feeling. But New South Wales is actually home to half of the poker machines in this country. So New South Wales has around 90 poker machines out of our around 180, 190,000. So they are very concentrated in New South Wales. That is followed by Queensland, where Queensland have about a quarter of our poker machines. And then Victoria have around 1 in 6. And then the numbers get smaller and the proportions get smaller. In WA, for example, there are no pokies in pubs and clubs. So the only pokies in WA are in the casino. So in WA, they have less than 1% of our poker machines. So I was thinking, Don, it'd be really interesting to explore some of those jurisdictional differences a bit, given the availability in the different jurisdictions, and to see if the magnitude of what you're seeing is similar, or just, I thought that might be really interesting to have a look at that. Building on looking at different across the different jurisdictions, I thought if you could extend out your data, I think you had up until early 2020, extend it out to look at COVID, the impacts of COVID and venue closures, but also post-COVID. So what we've seen is really that people have returned as venues have reopened and restrictions have eased. We've seen that people have returned to EGM venues. So I think that would be really interesting. And I say this because in some work I did with my colleagues in the Australian Gambling Research Centre, led by Kate Sakata, we looked at this. We actually happened to be doing a survey when COVID kind of hit. And so we had this natural experiment. So what we were able to do is look at how we compared Victoria and New South Wales, where in Victoria, we were in full lockdown, venues had closed, and at the time they hadn't closed in New South Wales and there were few restrictions. So we were able to compare the two jurisdictions, and we wanted to look at how COVID and those venue closures impacted people's gambling. And what we found was that the shutdown of the venues in Victoria actually reduced gambling expenditure among people who gambled on pokies by 79% relative to people who gambled on poker machines in New South Wales. Huge, huge difference. And the other really important thing we found is that people in Victoria, people didn't move their spending to other forms of gambling. So they just reduced their gambling expenditure. So for example, they didn't, instead of gambling at the pokies, they didn't gamble online on sports and racing, they just reduced their gambling expenditure. So a really interesting natural experiment we found. So I thought that would be interesting for you to have a look at too, in terms of crime and how that might relate there as well. So again, building on the jurisdictional kind of analysis. My third thought, so I'm getting through them. It raised a lot of thoughts for me. Don, your work, it was great. My third thought was really thinking about the affected others piece a bit more, and whether from your data or other data, you're able to unpack the crime data a bit more. So, for example, thinking about the types of assault, can you drill down into, whether it might be a domestic violence related offence or assault? Can you drill down into who might be the victims? Just wondering about that affected others piece. And then thinking about that, is there other data, other health data, for example, that you could draw on? I was thinking about maybe LGA hospital level data on assaults. Like, is there something else that you could bring in to kind of unpack that a bit more, that affected others piece? And then my final thought so far is the role that alcohol plays in all of this. So thinking about, and I know you and others have done some great work in this space around alcohol density and assaults and those sorts of things. But I was particularly thinking about, the EGMs, poker machines are on premise where people are losing this money, thinking about whether you could look at alcohol, on-premise consumption of alcohol. I'm not sure. I was just thinking about the links there and whether, there's anything around co-consumption or other things. That's my fourth thought. A lot of thoughts, sorry, Don, for you to take away and think about. And I don't know if any of this is possible, but, I think it's really important research that you're doing, and just thinking about how you could potentially extend it.
They're great suggestions, really good suggestions. I'm particularly keen on the experimental one. If we could find a time when there was either no shutdown in Victoria and one in New South Wales, or the other way around, we could do a difference in difference there. Of course, the problem is usually that a lot of things happen in conjunction with a lockdown or with COVID. But I think that's an idea well worth exploring. Yes, it's certainly possible to break the data down in a more refined way. I must confess, I suggested assault only as a last minute thing. I thought mostly it will be property crime. Robbery wasn't common enough to look at that. So I was quite surprised to see assault come back so strongly. And it would be worth having a look at, given that the trends, for example, in New South Wales between domestic assault and non-domestic assault are going in different directions. It would be well worth having a look at that. So that's a really good suggestion. I could spend all the time talking about what you've just suggested, but I better shut up so other people can ask any questions or make any comments they want to make. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, guys. And I mean, some of the ideas that you've raised, Beck, have been raised in the chat as well. So we might, naturally come to them in a bit more detail as we go. So, Don, we've got a few methods questions. So maybe we'll do a bit of a rapid fire methods bit, and then we'll come back to just some of the other questions that have come up. So firstly is a question about seasonality. Did you notice any seasonality effects during the analysis?
Oh, well, I didn't look at the raw data myself in any detail. I left that to my statistician colleagues, but almost certainly there will be strong seasonality in the results. I would be very surprised if the gambling during the summer months was as low as it is during the winter months, but I could stand corrected, and there may be people out there who know better than I do. But the seasonal controls were significant, so that would tell you that there's definitely a seasonal effect.
Yeah, no worries. Okay. Did you control for any population changes, like, for example, changes in LGA boundaries? And so the population numbers might change within a particular LGA?
Yeah, really good question. So the data was reconstituted. The boundaries did change, but gaming and racing, liquor and gaming, I always get that description wrong in the Bureau, reconstituted the data set. So it was all based on the contemporary boundaries. In other words, all these agencies have the capacity to reframe the boundaries any way they wish. So what they did was they reframed the boundaries so that even the boundaries under the old legislation or the old arrangement were recast under the new ones. Well, look, the short story, I didn't explain that very well. The short story is, so far as the data was concerned, there's no change in the boundaries at all over the period of the study.
Okay, yep, no worries. Okay, a couple more before we do a bit more of a discussion. So is there data available, or can the capture of data occur for online gambling?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. Liquor and gaming may be able to answer that. I'm not sure they can, but I'll just have to pass on that question. So far as the crime data is concerned, absolutely, you can download it from the Bureau website free of charge. If you want to go down a little deeper into the kinds of crime, for example, splitting assault up into different subcategories of common, actual bodily harm, grievous bodily harm, you'll have to make a special request to Boxar. But I'm sure they can handle that. I think questions about further disaggregation of data on expenditure, you'd have to ask Liquor and Gaming New South Wales for the answer to that question.
Okay, sure. Okay, so this one's about disequilibrium. So Malcolm said, I didn't follow the analysis of the disequilibrium. Was it saying that there was a lag of the gambling effect on crime and that it was effectively zero? Just have another go at that one.
No, you remember that if you cast your mind back to that graph of the drunk and the dog, as you see from minute to minute, there's a bit of kind of random variation. Sometimes they seem to be in lockstep and sometimes they appear to be moving in slightly different directions. So basically, whenever the gap between the drunk and the dog isn't constant, departs momentarily, it's out of equilibrium. And the question is, how long does it take to get back to equilibrium? The picture I showed you, it's almost perfectly back there. It hardly goes away at all. But co-integration still exists, even if, for the sake of argument, looking at that, even if the dog wanders off, or I should say expenditure wanders off in a different direction to crime for a couple of months. The question is, how long does it take for it to get back in sync with the crime data? So disequilibrium happens when the two variables, in our case, expenditure and crime, suddenly start moving away from one another. And if they're in equilibrium, they will come back. And the question is, how long does it take them to get back? In our case, in that particular thing, it only takes them a month. If one of them gets hit by, I don't know, an interest rate increase and heads off in the wrong direction, or someone closes down a few LGAs, a few poker machines for a while, and that sort of makes expenditure drops, and then they're back online. How long does it take for it to come back to the relationship where there's basically a constant distance between the two? Does that make sense? I hope it does.
Yeah, I think I get it. But I can also understand that it's a confusing concept.
All right, I shouldn't have shown that perhaps. But sometimes, these two variables can wander away from one another for a while before coming back. And the question is, how long does it take for them to come back into this nice, neat relationship where they're always a constant distance from one another?
Yeah, right. Okay, great.
Okay.
Thanks.
Sorry if that's no good.
No. That's good. That's good. Okay, so I'm going to ask one more and then we'll have a bit more of a discussion. So this one here is about, can you advise, so at the beginning you were talking about money spent on gambling per head of population. I think Becky mentioned this as well. Yeah. Can you just advise what that was again?
That was data drawn for the Household Income and Labour Dynamics Survey, which on a few years actually has asked people specific questions about their gambling, asked them the questions what I showed the data on, have you spent more than you can afford? Have you bought or sold something to pay your gambling debts? Have you been stressed or suffered from, stress-related reaction because of your gambling problem? So in the Hilda survey, they've got a lot of interesting questions like that. And I just wanted people to see how widespread the effects of gambling can be. It's not just crime. It's not just, unemployment, divorce, and so on. It affects a lot of people in a lot of ways.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think that really comes back to Beck's point about the affected others piece.
That's right. It's not just the problem gamblers. And I think part of the problem, if I can overuse that word, is that people tend to say, oh, well, look, that's just the problem gambler. They're the ones that are suffering, and they've got to get their act together. Well, it's not just them. It's much bigger than that.
Yeah, sure. Exactly. That's right. Great. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next. We've got lots of questions, so I'm trying to just wrap it along.
Okay.
So, Beck, you've talked a little bit about this, but just quickly, again, to both of you, did you think there was any effects from COVID, from shutdowns and things that were impacting on the data or that would? And then the second part of the question is about domestic violence. Have you looked at, or is it possible to look at domestic violence type offences and the relationship between gambling and expenditure? Big question.
I think Beck should go first.
Okay.
Just in terms of the COVID question, we did do a study during COVID, and we've looked at kind of a lot of other data since, including industry data. We did find, as I said, with venue closures, so we did find a decrease in gambling on pokies, but an increase in gambling online. Most of that increase in gambling online was among people who were already gambling online, but they started spending more and gambling more. And we found that that was particularly the case for some populations, and really it was young men. So young men aged 18 to 35, gambling more, spending a lot more money, experiencing more harm. So we did find that during COVID. Post-COVID, we've seen returns, as I mentioned, to gambling, venue-based gambling, gambling on pokies, but we've seen the sustained increases in online wagering that we saw have been maintained as well at those higher levels. So some really interesting research coming out post-COVID. Just in terms of the assault piece and the domestic violence piece, I think it would be great, and Don can talk to how we might unpack that a bit more, but I was involved in an ANROS funded study where we looked at domestic violence related assaults among women and other kind of domestic violence, including financial abuse, emotional abuse, and other types of violence. And, what came through so strongly is how people, and building on that affected others piece, how people are affected by others gambling and in violent ways, and in abusive ways. So there's some, and that was a lot of qualitative work we did, and I think Don will be able to draw that out in his data a bit more.
Yes, one of the problems with looking at domestic violence at the moment is that there's been, over the last few years, quite a substantial increase in willingness of people to report it. So the police data reflect in part the incidents, but also in part the change in public willingness to report it. One way to get around that might be, and I'm not sure about this, whether the health emergency admission data could be broken down according to whether it was a domestic related assault injury or not. And another alternative is to restrict the analysis to the most serious forms of domestic assault, all of which would have been reported and is less affected by changes in public willingness to report it. But it is a little tricky to do, to look at the domestic assault. All the same, I think it's worth having a look and seeing what we can find going on in there.
That's great. Thank you both. Sort of following on from this, there's a question about mental health. This question's asking about, was there any results that you've looked at or any data that you've looked at, Don, around population mental health effects and age brackets of the gambler as well? So I guess opening that up to both of you, because I'm sure you're aware of this sort of work as well, Beck.
Yeah, I'm sure Beck knows more about that than I do. To be honest, I haven't looked at that. It's individual level work. So I'll pass to Beck on that one.
Thanks, Don. Yeah, look, certainly we see links between both self-reported and when we use measures like the K6 and other kind of scales, we absolutely see links between people's gambling consumption. So, how often they're gambling and their expenditure and impacts on their mental health. There's certainly associations there. And people also self-report that when we ask them directly what impacts gambling having on their lives. Emotional, psychological impacts come through very strongly. And there's some work being done looking at gambling harms and the types of harms people might experience. Don touched on this in his presentation, so financial harms, obviously, but emotional and psychological harms and relationship harms are some of the main harms that people could experience.
Yes, I think that's more suited to surveys like the Hilda survey or the Australian Institute of Family Studies, which do tremendous work looking at the individual level effects.
Yeah, right. So maybe you can do that analysis, write that paper next on.
I think Beck's covered the field, but yeah, there's lots to do. We'll certainly talk
there
more
is lots
after
to
this.
Do. I mean, I'm really getting a sense for that just listening to Beck talk and thinking about the different directions I hadn't thought of. So yeah, it's great. It'll keep you busy.
I need it.
So this next question is about, you showed the relationship going from gambling to crime and it not being vice versa.
Yeah.
Maybe could we unpack that a little bit and just explore why you think that's occurring?
Well, first up, I should say I don't think our study is well equipped to pick up money laundering on a grand scale. I'm sure that is happening, but I don't think it's happening via the pokies. Having said that, I'm sure there's quite a few offenders who like to gamble and who take some of their ill-gotten gains and spend it on gambling. I'd be wary, as I say, about taking the results that I've just presented as an indication of the scale of money laundering. I think if you want to look at money laundering, you've probably got to look at other ways in which people might go about laundering money. For example, putting it through legitimate businesses and that sort of thing. But I'm not an expert on money laundering. I just thought I'd better look at both sides, given that there is quite a bit of evidence from government inquiries suggesting that money laundering is happening.
Great, thank you. Okay, so another kind of methodsy one. So were you able to test for differential relationships according to changes in the magnitude of crime in an LGA? So like were effect sizes proportional to the magnitude of crime in an LGA? Like, yeah, does that question
Yeah,
I'm not sure I read that out very well.
I got the idea. No, we weren't looking at, when you say the magnitude, you mean the sort of base level of crime. All I can say is that an LGA got a higher weight if it had less variance in its estimate of the effect of expenditure on crime. But that might be going a bit deep for some people. Certainly the LGAs don't have equal weight. They have a weight which is determined by, as I say, the precision of the estimate of the variance. But my statistician friends are out there somewhere smiling at me trying to explain these details. We were discussing it just before this started. So if people are really interested, you can email me and I'll put you in touch with my brilliant statisticians who can tell you more about autoregressive models. They know backwards.
Fancy stats, you mean?
Stats. Fancy stats. Good enough for me.
That's great. Okay, so I might take a break from the questions. I'm just coming back and thinking about some of what Beck was talking about before. Did you want to have a have a chat about any of those ideas, Don, that Beck raised, or unpack it in a bit more detail together?
Well, look, Beck said a lot. The two things that I think were really struck me was the interstate comparisons. I think it's kind of a natural experiment to see, given the huge variation between states and territories in the number of electronic gaming machines they have per head of population. So it's wide open for an interesting study. What would be really good is to look for times where one state or another state has changed its policy on gaming and then use another state as a control. So that way we could really get an estimate of the impact of changes in policy rather than just expenditure. Because ultimately it's the policymakers we want to inform, and the best way to do that is to evaluate what they do. So I think that's well worth pursuing. Unpacking crime, I think it would be nice to get into a lot more detail. It would be nice, for example, to have a look at what's actually being stolen, where the stolen goods markets are active still. That's certainly something, especially because there are signs of an uptick in property crime happening now. My book, The Vanishing Criminal, is going to have to be rewritten entirely because it doesn't seem to be vanishing now. There seems to be a bit of a resurgence. Hopefully that won't last. But look, I think the best thing is for me to sit down with Rebecca and have a longer chat about the possibilities. It's pretty hard to commit to anything just on a short sort of seminar presentation like this.
That's great. Did you want to add any comments, Beck, before we move on?
No, I haven't got anything more to add other than wishing I could answer that detailed question about whether we were comparing changes, the magnitude of the base level of crime in a local government area. I don't think that had any effect on the modelling.
No problem. Beck, did you have any comments or anything to add?
No, just to thank Don and his colleagues again for this really important work. I think we're always looking for more evidence to inform policy, as Don has said. And, this is a really important space. It's quite political. There are a lot of stakeholders, a lot of players in the game. But, for us, we take a very, very kind of public health lens to our work. And it is really around preventing harm is what we're looking to do. So all of this work really contributes to that. So thanks, Don.
My pleasure. And thank you for putting some more ideas in front of me.
Okay, we've got a couple more minutes, so I'm going to jump back into the questions if I can. So this question here from Lindsay is saying, could fraud crimes be disaggregated to identify fraud and theft offences from employers and charities? There's some evidence arising that these crimes have a greater impact on the community. So that's an interesting thought. Did either of you have any thoughts around that?
Well, it's certainly possible. The Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research can do amazing things with crime data. The constraint, though, is that you need to have the ideal situation is a non-zero amount of crime in each local government area and each month. If you start getting too many zeros, if you start getting too many occasions where in a particular month, in a particular LGA, there is no recorded crime, you're not getting value out of that. So that's especially true when you're talking about offences that are rare, like robbery, for example. It's a serious offence, but it's mainly in the city. You don't see much of it in the country. And so the lower limit is basically set by how prevalent the offence is. So the more you chop the offence up into smaller and smaller subcategories, the less easy it is to actually do the analysis.
Yeah, sure, that makes sense. So this final thought is around changes in Tasmania that have occurred in recent times. So there's been introduction of something called the card, which I don't know what it is, but I'm sure you guys will be aware. And just if you had any observations or thoughts to see if there would be any significant changes arising from the introduction of the card.
I know nothing about this. Thank you, Rebecca. Save me.
This is a cashless gambling card. So something we're very supportive of. There have been some delays to rollouts, but New South Wales, Victoria, and certainly Tasmania are considering this. Other jurisdictions may be, but this would be a card. So no more cash. A card that we would support if it requires, and it should require. It should be mandatory and it should be universal. And it should require people to set limits on that card as well. So, you know, and to be able to track data and you know, to, you know, make sure we're feeding back activity statements to people. But it's a cashless card that people would, you wouldn't be able to use pokies without it, but it would be across Tasmania. And we see this as a really important harm prevention strategy if, you know, a lot of safeguards are put in place around that.
Okay. Oh, that's great. I hadn't realised that was happening. So that'll be interesting to see the impacts.
It will be.
Yeah.
And great. It'll help with the money laundering too, Don.
Great.
Excellent. Okay, well, we've got through the bulk of the questions. There's a few more in there and a couple of comments. So I've grabbed them all. If anybody would like to comment or discuss further, please reach out to Don. I'm sure he'd be quite happy to get together and have a chat about anything that's arisen today, and maybe even rope in some statistical advice along the way.
Yep.
But we might call it there. So I'd like to really thank Don and Beck for joining us today and for having a really interesting discussion. I've learnt a lot. I didn't know a lot about this space. So it's been a really great talk. So thank you to both.
Thank you.
So from here, we're actually having a break next week, and we're back on the 25th with our next presentation about NDARC's own APSIL study, which will be presented by Dr. Wing, one of NDARC's researchers. So we'll look forward to seeing you then. For the rest of the week, enjoy NAIDOC, and we'll catch up with you in 2 weeks' time. Thanks a lot.
Bye.